January 30th, 1945, Central Luzon, the Philippines. The hour is somewhere between darkness and daylight. That strange moment when the world holds its breath before the sun reveals what the night has hidden. Across a wide expanse of rice paddies, flatland interrupted only by sparse vegetation and the occasional nipper hut, 120 American soldiers lie pressed against the earth. They are Rangers, members of the 6th Ranger Battalion, and they have been crawling on their bellies for hours, moving at a pace so agonizingly slow that the mind rebels against it. Every inch forward is a negotiation with patience, with fear, with the knowledge that one mistake, one cough, one stumbled footfall could doom not just themselves, but the 513 men they've come to save. Above them, the sky is vast and indifferent, scattered with stars that will soon fade. The air is thick with humidity, somewhere around plus 28 degrees Celsius, even at this ungodly hour, and it clings to skin, makes breathing feel like drinking. 1.5 kilometers away, behind barbed wire and bamboo fences and guard towers, manned by men with orders to kill everyone inside if liberation seems imminent, are the survivors of Bataan. They are ghosts in the shape of men, human beings reduced to skeletons, Americans and Filipinos who have endured 3 years of hell in a place called Cabanatuan. This is their last chance. This is everyone's last chance. And the question that hangs in that pre-dawn silence is not just whether the raid will succeed, it's whether it's even possible. Because what's about to happen shouldn't work. The odds are impossible. The enemy outnumbers them. The prisoners are too weak to run. And if the Japanese discover what's happening, if they execute their standing orders, then the greatest rescue mission in American military history will become its greatest tragedy. To understand the rescue, you have to understand the prison. To understand the prison, you have to understand the defeat. And to understand the defeat, you have to go back to April 1942, to the moment when the largest American surrender in history transformed tens of thousands of soldiers into property of the Japanese Empire. The fall of Bataan and Corregidor wasn't just a military catastrophe, it was a psychological apocalypse. General Douglas MacArthur, the theatre commander, had escaped to Australia in March, leaving behind promises that help was coming, that reinforcements would arrive, that the men holding the Philippines just needed to endure a little longer. They endured. They starved. They fought with World War I-era weapons and dwindling ammunition. They watched the skies for American planes that never came. And when the inevitable surrender finally arrived, when Major General Edward King Jr. handed over his sword to the Japanese on April 9, 1942, more than 75,000 Filipino and American troops became prisoners of war. What followed was the Bataan Death March, a forced movement of already starving, disease-ravaged men across 65 miles of jungle roads under a merciless tropical sun. Temperatures soared above plus 37 degrees Celsius. Men who fell were bayoneted. Men who asked for water were shot. Men who tried to help their comrades were beaten. Somewhere between 5,000 and 18,000 men, the exact number will never be known, died during that march or in its immediate aftermath. The survivors were distributed among various prison camps, and one of the largest was Cabanatuan, about 100 miles north of Manila, in Nueva Ecija province. Cabanatuan prison camp was not designed to rehabilitate or even to hold prisoners in any humane sense. It was designed to extract labor and to punish. The camp complex sprawled across several compounds, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and the constant presence of armed Japanese soldiers. At its peak, Cabanatuan held more than 8,000 American prisoners. By January 1945, that number had dwindled to around 500, not because men had been released, but because they had died of disease, of starvation, of beatings, of despair. The men who remained were living on approximately 700 calories a day, a ration barely sufficient to keep a sedentary person alive, utterly inadequate for men forced to perform labor. Diseases that should have been treatable, dysentery, beriberi, malaria, dengue, became death sentences. The prison hospital, such as it was, had almost no medicine. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia. Men died in the middle of the night and were buried in mass graves the next morning. One prisoner, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Mack, would later recall that the most haunting sound in Cabanatuan wasn't the guards shouting or the occasional gunshot, it was the silence of men who had given up talking because they didn't have the energy, the silence of men who had stopped dreaming because dreaming required hope, and hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. By late 1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had transformed. Douglas MacArthur had made good on his promise to return to the Philippines, landing at Leyte in October with the full weight of American industrial and military power behind him. The Japanese were in retreat, their empire crumbling, their supply lines severed. But this created a horrifying calculus for the prisoners at Cabanatuan. American intelligence had intercepted reports and heard rumors that the Japanese High Command had issued orders regarding prisoners of war. If liberation seemed imminent, the prisoners were to be executed. This wasn't paranoia. It was based on documented evidence from other camps, from places like Palawan Island, where in December 1944, the Japanese had herded 150 American POWs into air raid shelters, doused them with gasoline, and set them ablaze. Those who tried to escape the flames were machine-gunned or bayoneted. Only 11 men survived to tell the story. The Palawan massacre sent shockwaves through the American military command. If it could happen there, it would happen at Cabanatuan. And so, as MacArthur's forces pushed northward through Luzon in January 1945, as American tanks and infantry began closing in on the Japanese positions, a desperate race against time began. The prisoners at Cabanatuan had to be rescued before the Japanese could carry out their execution orders. But how do you liberate a camp deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by Japanese units, guarded by soldiers who have been ordered to kill everyone inside? The answer came in the form of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci and the 6th Ranger Battalion. Henry Mucci was not a man given to sentimentality or grand speeches, but he understood the magnitude of what was being asked of him. His Rangers, the 6th Ranger Battalion, had been training for months in New Guinea and the Philippines, specializing in rapid assaults, night operations, and missions that required small units to accomplish what larger forces could not. They were volunteers, every one of them. Men who had chosen the Rangers because they wanted to be where the action was hottest. Now, in late January 1945, they were about to face the most unconventional mission imaginable. Not to destroy an enemy position, not to capture territory, but to sneak behind enemy lines, liberate a prison camp, and escort more than 500 emaciated, sick, barely mobile prisoners back through 30 miles of hostile territory to American lines. The briefing took place at the Ranger Base camp near Calasiao. Mucci gathered his men, and Captain Robert Prince, who would lead one of the assault teams, spread out reconnaissance photographs and hand-drawn maps of Cabanatuan. The intelligence was a patchwork, some of it from aerial reconnaissance, some from Filipino guerrillas who had been monitoring the camp for years, some from escaped prisoners who had managed to reach American lines. What they knew was sobering. Cabanatuan was located near the town of Cabanatuan City, on relatively flat terrain, surrounded by rice paddies that offered almost no cover. The camp itself was divided into compounds, with guard towers at regular intervals, a main gate, and barracks buildings where the prisoners were housed. The Japanese garrison at the camp numbered somewhere between 200 and 300 soldiers, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the Japanese units moving through the area. Intelligence suggested that elements of the Japanese 359th Infantry Regiment, along with other retreating units, were passing along the nearby highway, potentially numbering several thousand troops. If the raid was detected, if those units converged on Cabanatuan, the Rangers and the prisoners would be annihilated. Captain Prince, a 26-year-old Californian with a methodical mind and a reputation for coolness under pressure, took on the task of tactical planning. The raid would have to happen at night, that much was obvious, but it couldn't happen too early in the night, when guards were most alert, and it couldn't happen too late, because the Rangers would need darkness to escort the prisoners back. The sweet spot, Prince calculated, was around 7:30 or 8 in the evening. Late enough that the guards might be settling into routine, early enough that the Rangers would have hours of darkness for the escape. The plan called for the battalion to divide into several teams. Prince would lead the assault on the main gate and the front section of the camp. First, Lieutenant John Murphy would take another team to assault the rear. The Rangers would be supported by Alamo Scouts, an elite reconnaissance unit that had already infiltrated the area to gather intelligence, and by Filipino guerrillas under the command of Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Joson. The guerrillas would play a critical role. They would set up blocking positions along the nearby highway and along the Cabu River to prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching the camp during the raid. The Filipinos knew the terrain intimately, had been resisting Japanese occupation for years, and were eager to strike back. Pajota, a former schoolteacher turned guerrilla commander, told Mucci through an interpreter that his men would hold the line to the last bullet. There was also the question of the prisoners themselves. Medical officers who had seen reconnaissance photos and heard reports from escaped POWs estimated that many of the prisoners would be unable to walk more than a few hundred yards. Mucci made arrangements for carabao-drawn carts to be positioned along the escape route, but there was no guarantee that would be enough. Some men might have to be carried. Some might not survive the journey even if the raid succeeded. On the morning of January 28th, the Rangers set out. They moved on foot, 120 men covering the 30 miles from the American front lines to Cabanatuan, through a landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and menacing. The fields of central Luzon stretched out in every direction, vivid green rice paddies interspersed with villages and groves of bamboo. The sun hammered down, temperatures climbing past plus 35 degrees Celsius by midday, and the Rangers sweated through their uniforms, conserving water, moving with the disciplined silence of men who knew that noise could kill. They were dressed in standard olive drab, with most of their gear stripped down to essentials: rifles, ammunition, grenades, medical supplies. No heavy packs, nothing that would slow them down. Filipino guides led them along trails that avoided Japanese patrols, through villages where locals watched with wide eyes and offered quiet prayers. The guerrillas had done their job. Well, intelligence updates came in throughout the march. Japanese units were moving, but not toward the Rangers. Not yet. On the night of January 29th, the Rangers reached a staging area about 5 miles from Cabanatuan. They rested in a mango grove, and the Alamo scouts went forward to conduct final reconnaissance. What they reported back was both encouraging and terrifying. The camp's guard strength appeared lower than expected. Many Japanese soldiers had been pulled away to reinforce positions against the American advance. But a large Japanese convoy, possibly 1,000 soldiers or more, was camped just across the Kabu River, less than a mile from the prison. If that unit got involved, the mission would fail. Mucci made the decision to postpone for 24 hours, waiting to see if the Japanese convoy would move on. It did, pulling out on the morning of January 30th. The window was open. The raid would go that night. The Rangers began their final approach in the late afternoon of January 30th. The sun was descending toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rice paddies, and the heat of the day was just beginning to relent, though the air still hung thick and damp, somewhere around plus 30 degrees Celsius. The men moved in single file, crouched low, using every fold in the terrain, every ditch and hedgerow to conceal their advance. The plan called for them to reach assault positions around 7 p.m., lie in wait, and launch the attack at 7:30 p.m. sharp. But nature and terrain refused to cooperate. The paddies were more waterlogged than expected, the vegetation sparser, and the Rangers found themselves crawling the last 800 yards on their stomachs, inch by agonizing inch, through mud and shallow water, toward a camp where guards in towers swept searchlights across the perimeter at irregular intervals. It took hours of lying motionless when the searchlights passed nearby, hours of sliding forward when the lights moved away, hours of breathing slowly, controlling heartbeat, ignoring the cramping muscles and the mosquitoes that swarmed in the damp air. Above them, at precisely 7:15 p.m., an American P-61 Black Widow night fighter roared over the camp at low altitude. This was part of the plan, a deliberate distraction. The pilot, Major Kenneth Shriver, made several passes, his engines thunderous, drawing the attention of the Japanese guards, who watched the sky and rushed to positions, assuming an air raid was imminent. While the guards' eyes were turned upward, the Rangers moved the final few yards into position. At 7:30 p.m., the attack began. Captain Prince fired a single shot, a prearranged signal, and the camp erupted. Rangers poured through the front gate and through gaps in the fence that had been cut seconds before. They moved fast, weapons up, firing at guard towers, at barracks buildings, at any Japanese soldier who appeared. The sound was overwhelming. M1 Garands cracking, Thompson submachine guns chattering, grenades detonating with dull thumps that sent shrapnel singing through bamboo walls. The Japanese guards, caught completely off guard, scrambled for weapons, some managing to return fire, others cut down before they could react. Tracer rounds streaked through the gathering darkness, painting red lines across the camp. Smoke from grenades and burning buildings began to fill the air, mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. The prisoners, huddled in their barracks, had no idea what was happening. Some thought it was an execution, that the Japanese had finally come to kill them all. Others thought it was an air raid, or an artillery barrage, or some hallucination brought on by malnutrition. Then they heard the voices shouting in English, "We're Americans! We're here to get you out!" The words didn't make sense at first. Americans? Here, it seemed impossible. Some prisoners wept, some laughed, some simply stared, unable to process what was happening. The Rangers moved through the camp methodically, clearing buildings, killing or capturing Japanese guards, using Bangalore torpedoes to blow open locked gates. First Lieutenant John Murphy's team hit the rear of the camp simultaneously, cutting off any retreat. Within the first 5 minutes, the majority of the Japanese garrison was dead or fleeing. But the Rangers knew this was just the beginning. The hard part was getting everyone out. Meanwhile, a mile away along the Cabu River and the nearby highway, Captain Juan Pajota's guerrillas were fighting a separate, desperate battle. The Japanese convoy that had left that morning had not gone far. Elements of it, along with other Japanese units retreating northward, had heard the gunfire and were now converging on Cabanatuan. Pajota's 200 guerrillas, armed with a mix of rifles, improvised weapons, and captured Japanese equipment, dug in and opened fire. The Japanese, superior in numbers and firepower, pressed the attack, trying to cross the river and break through to the camp. Pajota's men held. They held because they knew that if they didn't, the Rangers and the prisoners would die. The guerrillas fought at point-blank range, firing until their ammunition ran low, then fixing bayonets, then fighting hand-to-hand. The river ran red, bodies piled up on the banks. The Japanese, frustrated and disorganized, threw wave after wave at the guerrilla positions, and wave after wave was thrown back. For 30 minutes, Pajota's men held the line. It was the longest 30 minutes of their lives, and it saved the mission. Back inside the camp, the Rangers were organizing the evacuation. Medics moved among the prisoners, assessing who could walk and who couldn't. Some prisoners were so weak that when Rangers tried to lift them, their skin tore. Others were delirious with fever, unable to understand what was happening. The Rangers, many of them half the age of the prisoners, lifted emaciated men onto their shoulders, onto makeshift stretchers, onto their backs, and began moving toward the gates. "Come on, buddy, we're going home," one Ranger said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The prisoner he was carrying, a man who weighed perhaps 80 pounds, looked up at him and whispered, "I don't believe you." "Believe it," the Ranger said. "We're going home." By 8:01 p.m., the last of the prisoners were being moved out of the camp. The Rangers set demolition charges on key buildings and ammunition stores, denying the enemy anything of use. The explosions lit up the night, and the column of Rangers, prisoners, and guerrillas began the long march back. They moved through the darkness, guided by Filipino scouts, carrying men who could not walk, pausing only when absolutely necessary. Behind them, fires consumed what remained of Cabanatuan. The Japanese, regrouping and realizing what had happened, sent patrols in pursuit. But by then the column was deep into guerrilla-controlled territory, moving along paths the Japanese didn't know existed. Fighter cover arrived at dawn the next day, American P-51 Mustangs screaming overhead, strafing any Japanese units that got too close. The prisoners looked up at those planes with tears streaming down their faces. Some hadn't seen an American aircraft in 3 years. Now they were everywhere, circling like guardian angels. By the evening of January 31st, 30 hours after the raid began, the entire column reached American lines. Every single prisoner, all 513 of them, had survived the rescue. 2 Rangers had been killed in the assault, along with 21 guerrillas. Approximately 523 Japanese soldiers had been killed. The casualties were asymmetric, almost unbelievable. In the history of special operations, few missions have achieved such lopsided success. The raid on Cabanatuan became instantly the stuff of legend. The prisoners were taken to field hospitals, where doctors struggled to comprehend the level of physical deterioration they were witnessing. These were not just malnourished men, they were human beings on the edge of biological collapse. Many weighed between 70 and 90 pounds, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue just to stay alive. Their teeth were loose from scurvy. Their joints were swollen from beriberi. Open sores covered their skin. Some had diseases that doctors hadn't seen outside of medical textbooks. The medical staff worked around the clock, administering fluids, antibiotics, vitamins, carefully refeeding men whose digestive systems had forgotten how to process normal food. For some prisoners, the psychological shock of liberation was as dangerous as the physical condition. They had spent years believing they had been forgotten, abandoned, left to die in a forgotten corner of a forgotten war. The idea that 120 men had risked everything to save them, that the US Army had mounted the most audacious rescue operation in its history specifically for them, was overwhelming. Some wept for days, others withdrew into silence, unable to articulate what they felt. Captain Bob Prince later recalled visiting the field hospital and being approached by a skeletal figure who grabbed his hand and held it without speaking. Just held it, tears running down his face. "I didn't know what to say," Prince admitted years later. "What do you say to a man who's been through hell and back? I just held his hand and told him he was safe now. That's all I could do." The guerrillas who had fought at the Kabu River and along the highway received less immediate attention, but their contribution was incalculable. Captain Juan Pejota's men had held off a force many times their size, suffering significant casualties, knowing full well that if they failed, every American Ranger and every liberated prisoner would die. The bond forged between the Rangers and the Filipino guerrillas during that operation was deep and lasting. Henry Mucci later said, "The Filipinos saved us. We couldn't have done it without them. They knew the terrain, they provided intelligence, they fought like demons, and they asked for nothing in return except to see their country free." For the Rangers, the raid became the defining moment of their service. The 6th Ranger Battalion had accomplished something that seemed impossible on paper, not through overwhelming firepower or technological superiority, but through meticulous planning, discipline, courage, and a refusal to leave anyone behind. They had proven that special operations, when properly conceived and executed, could achieve objectives far beyond their size and resources. The psychological impact on the broader American war effort was also significant. News of the raid spread quickly, boosting morale among troops throughout the Pacific. It was a reminder that the United States took care of its own, that prisoners of war were not forgotten, that liberation was real. For a military that had endured years of island-hopping campaigns, brutal jungle fighting, and the grinding attrition of the Pacific War, the Cabanatuan raid was a moment of pure, unambiguous triumph. But for the liberated prisoners, the aftermath was complicated. Many never fully recovered from their ordeal. The physical damage, malnutrition, disease, trauma left lasting scars. Some developed chronic health problems that plagued them for the rest of their lives. Others struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the Death March, of watching friends die, of the constant fear that had defined their existence for 3 years. Some returned to civilian life and tried to forget, burying their experiences, refusing to talk about Cabanatuan or Bataan or the war. Others felt compelled to tell their stories, to bear witness, to ensure that what happened to them would not be erased from history. One survivor, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Mack, spent decades documenting the experiences of POWs, collecting testimonies, writing letters, fighting to ensure that the men who died in captivity would be remembered. He once said, "We owe it to the ones who didn't make it out. They suffered just as much as we did, but they didn't get to come home. The least we can do is tell their story." The Japanese guards and officers responsible for the conditions at Cabanatuan faced varying degrees of accountability. Some were tried for war crimes in the post-war period, convicted and executed or imprisoned. Others escaped justice, disappearing into the chaos of post-war Japan or dying before they could be brought to trial. The structural issues, the culture of brutality, the disregard for the Geneva Conventions, the calculated cruelty, were symptoms of a military system that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor and treated prisoners accordingly. The Cabanatuan raid did not change that system retroactively, but it did ensure that 513 men did not die because of it. Decades passed, and the raid on Cabanatuan slipped into the background of World War II history. It was overshadowed by larger battles Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The European theater, with its iconic D-Day landings and the liberation of concentration camps, dominated the public imagination. The Pacific War, despite its brutality and scale, often felt like a secondary narrative. And within the Pacific War, the liberation of POW camps was a footnote, a sidebar, a story that didn't fit neatly into the grand narrative of island assaults and carrier battles. Part of the reason the Cabanatuan raid faded from memory is that the men involved didn't seek glory. Henry Mucci and his Rangers returned to the United States as heroes, but they were uncomfortable with the label. They had done their job. They had brought the prisoners home. That was enough. Many of the Rangers went on with their lives, became teachers, businessmen, farmers, fathers. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't seek the spotlight. The surviving prisoners, similarly, often chose silence. For some, talking about Cabanatuan meant reliving it, and reliving it was unbearable. Others felt that no one who hadn't been there could truly understand. So why try to explain? There was also a broader cultural dynamic at play. Post-war America wanted to celebrate victory, not dwell on suffering. The narrative of POWs, men who had surrendered, who had endured humiliation and deprivation, didn't fit comfortably into a culture that valorized combat heroism and aggressive masculinity. It was easier to focus on the Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima than on the skeletal figures stumbling out of Cabanatuan. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something shifted. Books began to appear, telling the stories of the Bataan Death March, of the POW camps, of the raid. Hampton Side's 2001 book, Ghost Soldiers, brought the Cabanatuan raid to a new generation of readers, painstakingly reconstructing the mission from interviews, archives, and first-hand accounts. In 2005, the film The Great Raid, directed by John Dahl, attempted to bring the story to the screen, though it struggled to capture the scale and emotional complexity of the real events. What these retellings revealed was that the Cabanatuan raid wasn't just a military operation, it was a moral statement. In the midst of a war defined by massive casualties, industrial slaughter, and strategic calculations that measured lives in terms of acceptable losses, the raid said something different. It said that individual lives matter, that 513 men, forgotten in a prison camp behind enemy lines, were worth risking 120 lives to save, that the bonds of duty and comradeship extend beyond the battlefield, beyond victory and defeat, to the fundamental obligation to bring people home. This is why the Cabanatuan raid resonates today in ways that many larger battles do not. It's a human story. It's about courage, certainly, but also about compassion, about the refusal to abandon people, about the willingness to take enormous risks for a cause that has no strategic value except the value of human dignity. In an age of drone warfare and algorithmic targeting, of wars fought from a distance, the idea of Rangers crawling through mud for hours, of guerrillas holding a river crossing with their lives, of men carrying other men on their backs through 30 miles of hostile territory, it feels almost anachronistic, almost impossibly heroic. The lessons of Cabanatuan are both specific and universal. On the specific level, it demonstrated the effectiveness of special operations, the importance of intelligence and planning, the value of working with local forces who know the terrain and the enemy. It showed that speed, surprise, and audacity can overcome numerical disadvantage. It validated the Ranger ethos: small, highly trained units executing high-risk missions that conventional forces cannot. But on the universal level, the raid speaks to something deeper. It speaks to the question of what we owe each other, particularly in the worst circumstances. The prisoners at Cabanatuan had been written off by some. They were behind enemy lines. They were sick, weak, maybe dying anyway. The resources required to rescue them, men, time, risk, could have been allocated elsewhere to missions with clearer strategic outcomes. But Henry Mucci and the Rangers never saw it that way. They saw brothers in arms. They saw Americans who had fought and suffered and held on through 3 years of hell. And they saw an obligation to bring them home. That obligation, that refusal to abandon people, is the heart of the story. Years after the raid, a journalist asked Captain Robert Prince what he wanted people to remember about Cabanatuan. Prince thought for a long time before answering. "I want them to remember that it mattered," he finally said. "That those men mattered. That we didn't forget them, and we didn't leave them behind. That's all that matters, really. That when it came down to it, we did the right thing." The last known survivor of the Cabanatuan raid, Sergeant Major Calvin Chun, died in 2015 at the age of 96. With his passing, the living memory of the raid passed into history, joining the countless other stories of World War II that exist now only in archives, photographs, and the slowly fading testimonies recorded before time claimed its witnesses. But the story itself refuses to die. It lives on in the annual reunions that survivors held for decades, in the memorials erected at Cabanatuan, in the descendants of the Rangers and the prisoners who passed down the story to their children and grandchildren. It lives on in the training of modern special operations forces, who study the raid as a textbook example of mission planning and execution, and it lives on in the broader American consciousness, even if only as a half-remembered tale, a story heard once and filed away, ready to resurface when people ask themselves what courage looks like, what loyalty demands, what it means to leave no one behind. The raid on Cabanatuan was not the largest battle of World War II. It did not determine the outcome of the war. It did not involve thousands of troops or change the strategic balance in the Pacific. But it did something rarer and perhaps more valuable. It proved that individual lives, individual suffering, individual hope, these things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, even when the odds are impossible and the world has moved on to other concerns. That lesson, that truth is why the story matters. Not because it's a perfect military operation, though it nearly was, but because it's a perfect encapsulation of a principle that transcends war, transcends nations, transcends time. The principle is simple. We don't leave people behind. We don't forget. We come for you, no matter what. That's what 120 Rangers and 200 Filipino guerrillas said on January 30th, 1945. They said it with their actions, with their courage, with their willingness to crawl through mud and face impossible odds. And 513 men, walking out of hell into the darkness, heard that message and understood. They had not been forgotten. They were not alone. Someone had come. Against all odds, through all obstacles, someone had come. That is the rescue that shocked the world. That is the story that refuses to fade. That is the truth that echoes across the decades. A truth as vital now as it was on that humid night in 1945, when the gates of Cabanatuan finally swung open, and freedom, improbable and miraculous, walked in.